The moment that destroyed their marriage didn't look like a disaster. It looked ordinary. It was a quiet Tuesday evening. No shouting, no broken glass, no dramatic goodbye. Just the soft hum of the air conditioner, the faint glow of a city skyline outside the window, and a man standing in the middle of his living room, holding a decision that felt reasonable. Marcus Hale adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit, glancing at his watch like he had somewhere more important to be. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried no anger, just calm certainty. I think we should end this. No warning, no build-up. Just a sentence that landed like it had been rehearsed long before it was spoken. Now here's the question you need to ask yourself. Have you ever lost something important? Not because of a big mistake, but because of something small you didn't think mattered. A conversation you avoided. A question you didn't ask. A feeling you ignored. Because sometimes, the moments that look the most ordinary are the ones quietly changing everything. And what you're about to witness is not just a divorce story. It's what happens when assumptions replace understanding, and silence replaces truth. So, before we go any further, I want you to think about this. If you truly believed you understood someone you loved, would you still walk away? Or would you pause? Just long enough to ask one more question. Because Marcus didn't, and that decision, the one that felt small, is the reason everything fell apart. Zoe Bennett didn't react immediately. She was sitting on the edge of the couch, one leg folded beneath her, a book resting loosely in her hand. She had been reading just moments ago. Something light, something forgettable, but now the words had completely lost their meaning. I think we should end this. The sentence replayed in her mind. Slower this time. Careful, controlled, final. She looked up at him, not with shock, not even with anger, but with something quieter, understanding, and somehow, that made it worse. Okay, she said softly. The envelope didn't open easily. Zoe Bennett sat on the floor beside the small wooden drawer, her back resting lightly against the couch, her fingers tracing the worn edge of the paper like she was trying to remember something she had deliberately forgotten. Some things don't stay closed because they're unimportant. They stay closed because opening them changes you. She exhaled slowly, then slid her finger beneath the flap. The seal broke with a soft tear that sounded louder than it should have in the quiet apartment. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't unfold the paper, didn't read, because deep down, Zoe already understood something most people ignore until it's too late. Not every truth feels like relief when you finally face it. Sometimes it feels like responsibility, and responsibility changes everything. She finally unfolded the letter. Her father's handwriting filled the page, steady, familiar, grounding in a way that made her chest tighten before she even read the first line. Zoe, if you're reading this, then it means I'm no longer there to explain things the way I wanted to. Her breath caught slightly. The words blurred for a second, and she blinked quickly, forcing herself to focus. There are parts of your life I chose to keep from you, not because I didn't trust you, but because I wanted you to have the chance to build a life that wasn't influenced by what we have. Zoe swallowed. What we have. Her fingers tightened around the paper. A memory surfaced. Brief, distant. Her father once sitting across from her at the kitchen table, watching her carefully as she talked about wanting a simple life. You don't need much to be happy, she had said. He didn't argue. He just smiled in that quiet way he had when he knew something she didn't. Back then, she thought it meant he agreed. Now, she wasn't so sure. Her eyes moved further down the page. You will find documents attached to this letter. They outline everything. Accounts, holdings, properties and trusts that are now entirely yours. Zoe's heartbeat slowed. Not sped up. Slowed. Because this wasn't shocking. Not really. It was confirming something she had always felt, but never fully explored. I know you chose a different kind of life. One built on connection, not wealth. I respected that choice. That's why I never forced this responsibility on you while I was alive. Her throat tightened. He hadn't hidden it out of control. He had hidden it out of respect. And somehow, that made it heavier. But life has a way of testing what we believe. And when that happens, you deserve to know exactly who you are and what you carry. Zoe lowered the letter slightly, staring at nothing in particular. What you carry. The words settled into her chest, deeper than she expected. Because suddenly, this wasn't about money. It was about identity. And identity is something you can ignore for years, until one moment forces you to face it. Her eyes returned to the page. Use this wisely, not just for yourself, but for the life you want to build. And remember, people will treat you differently when they know. Choose carefully who you allow to see this side of your life. Zoe let out a slow breath. That part, she already understood, better than anyone. Her gaze drifted unconsciously toward the door. The one Marcus had just walked out of. He never knew, not because she was hiding it out of fear, but because she never saw a reason to tell him. And now, sitting here with a letter in her hands, she had to confront something uncomfortable. Was that choice protecting their relationship, or quietly weakening it? Because while Marcus had been building his empire, measuring worth through growth, numbers, and visible success, Zoe had been living in a completely different reality, one where value wasn't something you proved, it was something you understood. And somewhere along the way, those two worlds stopped aligning. She folded the letter carefully, placing it on her lap. Then she reached back into the envelope and pulled out the documents her father had mentioned. The paper felt heavier, official, final. She skimmed through them slowly. Accounts, investments, trust structures. Her name attached to all of it. Not as a beneficiary waiting for access, but as the owner, complete control. Zoe leaned her head back against the couch, closing her eyes briefly. There it was. The truth. Not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. And the irony didn't escape her. Marcus had just ended their marriage because he believed she didn't fit into his future. Because in his eyes, she wasn't growing, wasn't building, wasn't enough. A quiet breath escaped her lips, something between a sigh and a small, almost disbelieving laugh. Not bitter, just aware. Because this wasn't about proving him wrong. That would be easy, too easy. This was about something deeper. Understanding why she never felt the need to prove anything in the first place. And whether that silence had cost her something she actually wanted to keep. Miles away, Marcus Hale stepped into his penthouse, dropping his keys onto the marble counter with a soft clink. The space was immaculate. Clean lines, neutral tones, everything in its place. It was the kind of environment designed to reflect control. And for the most part, it did. He loosened his tie, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. The view was impressive. It always had been, but tonight, it didn't feel as satisfying. He slipped his phone out of his pocket, scrolling through unread messages. Investors, partners, opportunities, all the things that mattered, all the things he had prioritized. So why did his mind keep drifting back to something that shouldn't matter anymore? Zoe, the way she said, okay. It didn't feel like acceptance. It felt like understanding. And that unsettled him more than resistance would have. Marcus frowned slightly, setting his phone down on the counter. He walked toward the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water he didn't really want. This was the right decision. He repeated it internally, like a fact that didn't need questioning. Zoe didn't fit into the life he was building anymore. She wasn't evolving at the same pace. She didn't push herself the way he did. And in his world, that mattered. It had to matter. Because everything he had built came from that mindset. Growth, expansion, forward movement. But as he leaned against the counter, something quiet slipped into his thoughts. A memory. Zoe sitting across from him months ago, watching him go over financial projections late into the night. You're chasing something, she had said. He hadn't looked up. That's how success works. She shook her head slightly. No. You already are successful. You're just trying to prove it to someone. He had dismissed it. At the time, it sounded like one of her abstract observations. Insightful, but impractical. Now, it felt different. Because for the first time, Marcus couldn't clearly answer a simple question. Who was he trying to prove it to? He pushed himself off the counter, exhaling sharply as if physically shaking off the thought. This wasn't the time for reflection. He had already made the decision, and decisions once made didn't get revisited. That was how he stayed ahead. That was how he maintained control. Right? But control has a weakness most people don't realize. It depends on information. And Marcus had made his decision based on what he believed was true, not what actually was. Back in the apartment, Zoe stood slowly, gathering the documents and placing them neatly back into the envelope. Her movements were calm, intentional, not rushed, because she wasn't reacting. She was processing. There's a difference. Reaction is emotional. Processing is deliberate. And Zoe had always been the kind of person who took her time understanding things, especially when they mattered. She walked to the small desk near the window, setting the envelope down carefully. For a moment, she just stood there, looking at it, at the life it represented, at the responsibility it carried. Then she turned away, not because she was ignoring it, but because she understood something important. Just because you finally can step into something, doesn't mean you should rush to do it. Growth isn't about speed, it's about readiness. Her phone buzzed again. This time, she picked it up. A message from Marcus. I'll have my lawyer send over the official documents tomorrow. We can keep this simple. Zoe read it once, then again. The words didn't sting, not the way they might have before, because now, she was seeing everything more clearly. This wasn't just his decision. It was the result of many smaller ones. Conversations they didn't have. Truths she didn't share. Assumptions he didn't question. And now, They were both standing at the outcome of those choices. She typed a response, paused, then erased it, typed again, paused again. Finally, she sent, okay, same word, different meaning. Because this time, it wasn't acceptance, it was closure. Zoe set her phone down, her gaze drifting back toward the window. The city lights shimmered in the distance, unchanged, indifferent, constant. Life didn't stop for endings. It just continued, and so would she. But not as the version of herself Marcus thought he understood, and not as the version she had been avoiding. Something had shifted, quietly, completely. And while Marcus walked forward believing he had simplified his life, Zoe stood at the beginning of something far more complex. Because the truth doesn't just reveal itself, it demands something in return. And what she chose to do next would define everything that followed. If this story is already making you feel something, then you're in the right place. This is Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, where every story carries a lesson you don't see coming. So if you believe love isn't just about feelings, but about choices, go ahead and subscribe, because what happens next might change the way you see relationships forever. The morning after the decision didn't feel dramatic. There was no storm, no emotional collapse, no sudden realization, just routine. And that's how most people convince themselves they made the right choice. When life continues, as if nothing important was lost. Marcus Hale woke up at exactly 6 a.m., like he always did. No alarm needed. Discipline had replaced habit a long time ago. He sat up slowly, ran a hand over his face, and glanced around his bedroom. Everything was in place. Clean, organized, predictable. No trace of Zoe, no reminder of last night. Just order. He stood, adjusted his posture slightly in the mirror, and moved through his morning routine with quiet precision. Shower, suit, coffee. Black, no sugar. Simple, efficient, controlled. And yet, something felt slightly off. Not enough to stop him. Just enough to exist. That subtle kind of discomfort most people ignore because it doesn't demand attention. But discomfort doesn't need to be loud to be important. Sometimes, it whispers. And Marcus had spent years training himself not to listen. By 7:30 a.m., he was already seated in the back of his car, reviewing documents on his tablet as the city moved around him. Traffic, people, noise, all of it felt distant. His world was structured, predictable, built on logic. And in that world, last night's decision made sense. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't impulsive. It was necessary. At least, that's what he told himself. Morning, sir, his driver said. Marcus nodded slightly without looking up. Schedule? Back-to-back meetings until 3. Investors at 4. Dinner with the board at 7. Marcus scrolled through his calendar, mentally aligning his day. No gaps, no wasted time. That's how progress worked. But then, unexpectedly, his eyes paused on something that wasn't there. No message from Zoe, not even a question, not even a reaction. Just silence. And for some reason, that silence lingered longer than it should have. Most people, after something like that, would reach out. They would try to understand, try to fix, try to hold on. Zoe didn't, and that unsettled him in a way he didn't want to examine. He locked his screen and leaned back slightly. Focus. That's what mattered. Not emotions. Not second-guessing. He had built too much to let uncertainty creep in now. Because uncertainty slows people down. And Marcus Hale didn't slow down. The office buzzed with energy the moment he stepped in. Conversations paused. Eyes shifted. Respect. Immediate. Visible. Unquestioned. This was his environment, where things made sense, where effort turned into results, where control was rewarded. Good morning, Marcus, his assistant greeted, walking quickly beside him. Morning. You have the investor briefing in 20 minutes. They're expecting strong projections for fourth quarter. They'll get them. No hesitation, no doubt. Because in this world, Marcus knew exactly who he was. Or at least, he thought he did. The meeting room was filled with sharp minds and sharper expectations. Numbers lit up the screen. Growth charts, forecasts, expansion strategies. Marcus stood at the front, confident, composed, in complete control of the narrative. This quarter reflects not just growth, but sustainability, he said, his voice steady, measured. We're not chasing short-term gains. We're building long-term dominance. Heads nodded. Notes were taken. Impressions were made. This was his strength. Clarity, direction, authority. And yet, mid-sentence, something unexpected happened. A brief pause, barely noticeable to anyone else. But to Marcus, it felt louder than it should have. Because for a split second, his mind drifted. Not to the numbers, not to the strategy, but to Zoe, to the way she used to sit quietly during his late-night presentations at home, listening, Not interrupting, not questioning, just observing. And then, when he finished, she would say something simple. You're good at explaining where you're going, but not always why. He used to brush it off, because why didn't matter as much as results. But standing here now, surrounded by people who valued what he produced, a quiet thought surfaced. When was the last time someone asked him why, and actually meant it? He cleared his throat slightly, regaining focus. And that's why our position remains strong moving into the next fiscal cycle. The moment passed. The room responded, but something small had shifted. Again, quietly. After the meeting, Marcus stepped into his office, closing the door behind him. The silence inside felt different from the silence at home. Here, it felt productive, useful, but today, it lingered. He loosened his tie slightly, walking toward the window. The city stretched endlessly below him. Opportunity, movement, control, everything he had worked for. So why did it feel like something was missing? Not something obvious, something subtle, like a conversation that never happened, or a truth that was never spoken. His phone buzzed. A message from his lawyer. Divorce documents, ready for review. Marcus stared at the notification for a second longer than necessary. This was progress. Closure. Simplification. Exactly what he wanted, right? He tapped the message open. Read through the summary. Everything was clean, efficient, no complications, just like he planned. And yet, his thumb hovered over the screen, not because he didn't agree, but because something about it felt incomplete, like he had skipped a step, or overlooked something important. But what? He exhaled sharply, locking the phone and setting it down on his desk. This wasn't complicated. He was making the right decision based on the information he had. That's what rational people do. They don't hesitate. They don't overthink. They act. And Marcus had already acted. Across the city, Zoe Bennett sat by the window of her apartment, a cup of tea cooling slowly in her hands. The envelope rested on the table beside her. Still there, still real, still waiting. But unlike last night, she wasn't overwhelmed. She was calm. Because clarity, once it settles, changes how everything feels. She had spent the morning quietly reviewing the documents again. Not rushing, not reacting, just understanding. And what she understood was simple. Her life hadn't changed overnight. She had just become aware of something that had always been there. And awareness is different from transformation. It doesn't force you to act. It invites you to choose. Her phone buzzed softly. A notification, legal email. She didn't open it immediately. Instead, she looked out the window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. For a long time, she had defined herself by what she didn't need. Didn't need wealth, didn't need status, didn't need validation. But now, she had to ask herself something more honest. Was that strength or avoidance? Because sometimes, not choosing something isn't clarity. Sometimes, it's fear, disguised as simplicity. Zoe took a slow sip of her tea, her eyes thoughtful. Marcus believed she wasn't growing, and maybe, in his way, he was right. Not because she lacked potential, but because she had been standing still, intentionally, avoiding responsibility, avoiding identity, avoiding the version of herself she now had no choice but to face. She set the cup down gently. Her gaze shifted to the envelope, then back to the city. And for the first time since everything changed, Zoe didn't feel like she had lost something. She felt like she was being asked a question, one she couldn't ignore anymore. What kind of life do you actually want? Not the comfortable one, not the easy one, the real one. And unlike Marcus, she wasn't rushing to answer it, because she understood something he didn't. The right decision isn't always the fastest one. Sometimes, it's the one you take the time to fully understand. And while Marcus continued moving forward, confident in his clarity, Zoe stood still, not out of weakness, but because she was finally ready to see everything clearly, and that difference would soon change everything. The illusion of clarity is dangerous, because it feels like confidence, while quietly hiding what you never took the time to understand. Marcus Hale didn't see it yet. To him, everything was still aligned, decisions made, direction clear, progress intact. That's how his life had always worked. Identify the problem, remove it, move forward. And in his mind, Zoe had become a problem, not because she was difficult, but because she didn't fit, didn't match his pace, didn't reflect the life he was building. That's what he told himself, and the more he repeated it, the more it started to feel true. By late afternoon, Marcus sat across from a group of investors in a private dining room, the kind designed to impress without trying too hard. Subtle luxury, controlled atmosphere, everything intentional. What we're building isn't just expansion, it's positioning, Marcus said, his tone calm but commanding. We're not reacting to the market, we're shaping it. The investors exchanged approving glances. They liked confidence. They trusted certainty. And Marcus delivered both flawlessly. But one of them, a grey-haired man with quiet eyes and a habit of listening more than speaking, leaned forward slightly. "Let me ask you something," he said. Marcus paused. "Go ahead." The man studied him for a moment, then asked, "What's driving you right now?" It wasn't a complicated question, but it wasn't a simple one either. Marcus gave a small, controlled smile. "Growth," he answered. "Long-term positioning." The man nodded slowly, but didn't look convinced. "That's what you're building," he said. "Not what's driving you." A brief silence settled over the table. Most people would have brushed that off, redirected, moved on. But Marcus didn't respond immediately. Because for a second, just a second, he didn't have a better answer. And that bothered him. He cleared his throat slightly. "Results require focus," he said finally. "And focus requires clarity." The man leaned back, still watching him. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "clarity is just the story we tell ourselves, so we don't have to question our decisions." The words landed softly, but they didn't leave. Marcus felt it, a subtle shift, like something small had just been placed in his mind, and refused to move. The conversation continued. Business moved forward. Deals were discussed. But Marcus wasn't fully present anymore, because now, something uncomfortable had been introduced, a question he didn't have full control over. Later that evening, as Marcus sat alone in his car after the meeting, the city lights blurred past the window in long streaks of gold and white. His phone rested in his hand, unlocked, idle. He wasn't checking emails, wasn't reviewing documents, wasn't planning his next move. He was thinking, and that was unfamiliar territory. Because thinking, real thinking, requires slowing down. And Marcus didn't slow down. But today, something had forced him to. "What's driving you right now?" The question echoed again. He exhaled slowly, leaning his head back against the seat. Success. That's what should have come to mind. But it didn't feel like enough of an answer anymore. Because success had always been the goal. And now that he had it, why did it feel like something was missing? His grip tightened slightly around his phone. Without fully thinking, he opened his messages, scrolled, stopped. Zoe. Their last conversation stared back at him. Short, clean, final. "I think we should end this." Okay. That word again. Simple. But the more he thought about it, the less simple it felt. There was no hesitation in it. No confusion. No attempt to change his mind. And suddenly, a new thought surfaced. What if she wasn't surprised? What if she had already seen this coming? Marcus frowned slightly. That didn't sit well with him. Because if Zoe had understood something, he didn't. Then maybe. No. He stopped himself. That kind of thinking leads to doubt. And doubt leads to hesitation. And hesitation costs you everything. He locked his phone and looked out the window again. No. He had made the right decision. He had evaluated the situation based on what he knew. And what he knew was clear. Zoe wasn't aligned with his future. She didn't operate at his level. Didn't share his drive. Didn't push forward the way he needed. That was fact, wasn't it? But facts, without full information, are just assumptions that feel convincing. And Marcus had built his entire decision on what he believed to be true, without ever asking if it actually was. Across the city, Zoe Bennett sat at a long wooden table in a quiet office space she hadn't stepped into in years. It had belonged to her father, and somehow, it still felt like him. The same shelves, the same scent of old paper and polished wood, the same quiet presence that made everything feel grounded. The envelope sat open in front of her again. But this time, the documents weren't just something she was reading. They were something she was beginning to understand. A man in his early 50s sat across from her, calm, composed, observant. "Mr. Laurent, her father's longtime advisor. You've taken your time," he said gently. Zoe nodded. "I needed to." He smiled slightly. "That's something your father respected about you. You don't rush decisions just because they're important." Zoe glanced down at the papers. "It didn't feel real before," she admitted. "Now it does." Mr. Laurent leaned forward slightly, folding his hands. "Your father built everything with one intention," he said. "Not control, not power, but stability. For you," Zoe swallowed quietly. "I know. And now," he continued, "that stability is yours to manage." There it was again. Responsibility, not pressure, not expectation, just responsibility. Zoe leaned back slightly, her gaze thoughtful. "For a long time," she said slowly, "I thought choosing a simple life meant I was choosing the right life." Mr. Laurent didn't interrupt. "But now I'm starting to realize," she continued, "maybe I was just choosing the easier one." The room stayed quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "Ease and clarity often look the same at first," he said. Until life asks more of you. Zoe let that settle. Because it was true. She hadn't been wrong. But she hadn't been fully honest either. Not with herself. And definitely not with Marcus. She had allowed him to believe a version of her that was incomplete. And in doing that, she had unintentionally shaped the way he saw her. Not through lies, but through omission. And omission still carries consequences. Zoe exhaled softly. I never told him, she said. Mr. Laurent didn't ask who. He already knew. Why not? He asked gently. Zoe thought about it for a moment, then answered honestly. Because I didn't want it to change how he saw me. Mr. Laurent tilted his head slightly. And did it? Zoe gave a small, almost ironic smile. Yes, she said quietly. Just not in the way I expected. Later that night, Zoe walked out of the office building into the cool evening air, the city alive around her in ways she hadn't fully noticed before, not because it had changed, but because she had. Awareness does that. It doesn't alter the world. It alters how you see it. She paused on the sidewalk for a moment, looking out at the passing cars, the moving people, the quiet rhythm of life continuing without interruption. And for the first time since everything shifted, she didn't feel behind. She didn't feel uncertain. She felt present, because now she understood something clearly. Marcus made his decision based on who he thought she was, and she had allowed that version to exist, not intentionally, but consistently. And now, both of them were living in the outcome of that. The difference was, Zoe was ready to face it. Marcus wasn't, not yet, but he would be, because truth has a way of showing up, whether you're ready or not, and when it does, it doesn't just change what you see, it changes how you see yourself. Back in his penthouse, Marcus stood in the dark, the city lights casting long shadows across the floor. He hadn't turned on the lights, hadn't moved much since he got home. His mind was still caught on something he couldn't quite resolve. That question, that silence, that feeling. For the first time in a long time, Marcus didn't feel certain, and certainty had always been his strength. But now, it was starting to crack, just slightly, just enough. And sometimes, that's all it takes for everything to start unraveling. Not every truth arrives like a shock. Some truths arrive quietly and sit with you until you're ready to understand them. Zoe Bennett didn't rush the morning. That was the first change. Before, her days had always followed a quiet rhythm, simple routines, familiar patterns, a life built intentionally around calm. But now, that same calm felt different. Not passive, not avoidant, intentional. She stood in her kitchen, sunlight stretching across the counter, her tea steeping slowly as she leaned against the edge, her eyes resting on nothing in particular. The envelope sat on the table behind her, still open, still present, still asking something of her. And for the first time, Zoe wasn't avoiding it. She was considering it. There's a difference. Avoidance delays decisions. Consideration prepares you for them. She picked up her tea, taking a slow sip, letting the warmth settle before she turned and walked back toward the table. The documents were neatly arranged now, not overwhelming, not intimidating, just information. And information, when understood properly, isn't something to fear. It's something to use. Zoe sat down, pulling one of the documents closer. Account structures, long-term investments, generational assets built with patience, not speed. This wasn't the kind of wealth Marcus chased. This wasn't aggressive. It was intentional, quiet, strategic in a way that didn't need attention. And suddenly, something clicked. Marcus had spent years building something visible, something measurable, something that proved his worth. Her father had built something different, something that didn't need to prove anything at all. And Zoe, she had been standing somewhere in between, not fully stepping into either world, not because she couldn't, but because she never forced herself to choose. Until now, her phone buzzed softly. Another message, Marcus's lawyer. She stared at it for a second, then opened it. Formal language, structured sentences, clear expectations. The beginning of the legal end. Zoe read through it slowly, her expression calm, almost detached, not because she didn't care, but because she understood something most people don't when they reach moments like this. Emotion doesn't change the outcome. Clarity does. And right now, she had more clarity than she had ever allowed herself before. She set the phone down gently, then leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the window again. A memory surfaced, not loud, not dramatic, just there. Marcus, standing in this very apartment months ago, looking around with a subtle tension she hadn't fully addressed at the time. You're comfortable here, he had said. She smiled slightly. I like it. He nodded, but something in his expression didn't fully agree. It's just, you could have more. Zoe had shrugged softly. More isn't always better. He didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. And that was the moment. She should have asked him something. What does more mean to you? But she didn't, because asking that question would have required a deeper conversation. And deeper conversations change things. Now, sitting here with everything laid out in front of her, Zoe understood the cost of that silence. It wasn't just about what she didn't say. It was about what she never gave him the chance to understand. And understanding is what relationships are built on, not assumptions, not observations. Understanding. Across the city, Marcus Hale stood in front of his office window again, his reflection faint against the glass. It was becoming a habit. Standing here, thinking, which was unusual. Because Marcus didn't build his life by thinking too much. He built it by acting, deciding, moving. But lately, action didn't feel as clear as it used to. He adjusted his cuff slightly, his eyes scanning the city below without really seeing it. His phone sat on his desk behind him, unread messages piling up. Normally, that would bother him. Now, it didn't, because something else had taken its place. A question, persistent, unresolved. Why didn't she fight it? That was the part he couldn't let go of. Zoe wasn't passive. She wasn't weak. So, why did she accept it so easily? Unless she didn't see it as something worth fighting for. The thought hit harder than he expected. Marcus turned away from the window, grabbing his phone as if distraction would help. Emails, updates, numbers. He scrolled quickly, forcing his focus back into familiar territory. But even as he read, none of it felt as sharp as it usually did. Because clarity, real clarity, requires alignment. And something inside him wasn't aligned anymore. He opened the divorce documents again. Read through them. Clean, efficient, no emotional complication. Exactly what he wanted. So why did it feel like something was missing? Because for the first time, Marcus was starting to understand something uncomfortable. You can make a logical decision and still not fully understand it. And when that happens, doubt doesn't show up loudly. It shows up quietly, in pauses, in questions, in moments you can't quite explain. Back at the apartment, Zoe gathered the documents into a single folder, her movements calm, deliberate. She wasn't overwhelmed anymore. She was organizing, preparing, because once you understand something, the next step isn't reaction, it's direction. She stood, walking toward her bedroom, opening the closet slowly. Inside, her clothes were simple, neutral, uncomplicated, the kind of wardrobe that didn't demand attention. For years, that had felt like authenticity. Now, she wasn't so sure, because simplicity can be a choice, but it can also be a shield. Zoe ran her fingers lightly over the fabrics. Thoughtful. Who am I, without this version of myself? The question didn't scare her. It grounded her. Because, for the first time, she wasn't asking it out of confusion. She was asking it out of awareness. And awareness changes everything. Later that afternoon, Zoe sat across from Mr. Laurent again. A new set of documents in front of her. More detailed this time. More specific. This outlines your active role moving forward, he explained. Zoe nodded, her eyes scanning the pages. Responsibilities, decisions, influence. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was real. Most people, in your position, he continued, rush to take control immediately. Zoe looked up. I'm not most people. A small smile crossed his face. No, he agreed. You're not. She leaned back slightly. I don't want to rush this, she said. I want to understand it first. Mr. Laurent nodded approvingly. That's exactly how your father approached everything. Zoe's expression softened slightly at that, because now she understood something she hadn't fully appreciated before. Strength doesn't come from speed. It comes from clarity, and clarity takes time. That evening, as Zoe walked back into her apartment, the space felt different. Not because anything had changed physically, but because she had the same walls, the same furniture, the same quiet. But now, it felt like a place she was stepping out of, not abandoning, not rejecting, just evolving beyond. She placed the folder on the table, pausing for a moment as her gaze drifted across the room. Memories still lived here, but they didn't hold her the same way anymore. Because attachment changes when understanding grows. Her phone buzzed again, another message. This time, she knew who it was before she even looked. Marcus. She stared at the screen for a second, then opened it. I need to confirm a few things regarding the documents. Let me know when you're available. Professional, neutral, distant. Zoe read it once, then set the phone down without replying. Not because she was ignoring him, but because she understood something now that she hadn't before. Not every response needs to be immediate. Some require intention, and intention requires space. Across the city, Marcus stood in the quiet of his penthouse again, staring at his phone after sending the message, waiting, not impatiently, but noticeably which was new, because Marcus didn't wait. People waited for him. That's how his world worked. But now, he was the one standing still, and he didn't like it. Not because of control, but because of what waiting forces you to do. Think, and the more he thought, the less certain everything felt. Two people, same city, same ending, but completely different understandings of what it meant. And that difference was about to change everything. Some truths don't break you, they rearrange you. And once that process starts, you can't go back to who you were before you understood. Zoe Bennett didn't rush her response. Marcus's message sat on her phone longer than most people would allow. Not out of hesitation, not out of confusion, but out of intention, because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't reacting to him. She was responding to herself. That distinction mattered, a lot more than she used to realize. She stood by the window, her arms loosely folded, watching the city settle into evening. Lights flickered on. Conversations moved through the streets. Life continued, unaware of the quiet shift happening inside her. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. Marcus, just let me know what works for you. Short, controlled, still professional. But underneath it, there was something else. Impatience, not obvious, but present. Zoe stared at the message for a moment. Then, finally, she typed, "Tomorrow afternoon." She didn't add anything else. No explanation, no emotional layer. Just clarity, and clarity doesn't need decoration. Marcus read the message almost immediately. Tomorrow afternoon, that was it. No hesitation, no resistance, no emotion. And for some reason, that unsettled him more than anything else so far. He stared at the screen a second longer than necessary before locking his phone and setting it down. This should have felt easier, cleaner, but instead, everything about this felt slightly out of sync, because Zoe wasn't reacting the way he expected. And when people don't behave the way you predict, it forces you to question what you thought you understood. Marcus exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair as he leaned back against the couch. He had built his life on reading situations correctly, on understanding people, on making decisions based on accurate assessments. That's what made him successful. That's what gave him control. But now, that confidence had a crack in it. Small, but undeniable. Because if he had misread Zoe, then what else had he misread? The next afternoon arrived without urgency. No tension in the air. No dramatic build-up. Just time moving forward like it always does. Zoe arrived first. Of course she did. Not because she was eager, but because she preferred to enter situations prepared. She sat at a quiet table in a private meeting room arranged by Marcus's legal team. Clean space, neutral tones, minimal distractions, designed for efficiency, designed to keep emotions out. She placed her folder on the table, her posture relaxed but grounded, not defensive, not vulnerable, present. A few minutes later, the door opened. Marcus stepped in. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. They simply looked at each other, and in that silence, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, not of who they were, but of how much had changed. "Hi," Marcus said finally. Zoe nodded slightly. "Hi," simple, polite, distant. He took a seat across from her, adjusting his jacket slightly out of habit. For a second, it felt like one of their old conversations. Structured, measured, controlled, but something was different. Before, there was connection underneath the structure. Now, there was space, and space is harder to navigate than conflict. Marcus cleared his throat lightly. "I wanted to go over the documents before we finalize everything." Zoe nodded. "Okay." No resistance, no negotiation, just agreement. Marcus opened the folder in front of him, sliding a copy toward her. "These outline the asset division. It's straightforward." Zoe glanced down at the papers, then back up at him. "Straightforward based on what?" she asked calmly. The question wasn't confrontational, but it wasn't passive either. It required an answer. Marcus paused briefly. "Based on what we've built together," he said. Zoe held his gaze for a moment, then said quietly, "And what do you think that is?" The room shifted, subtly, because this wasn't about documents anymore. It was about understanding, and Marcus wasn't fully prepared for that. He leaned back slightly, choosing his words carefully. "Our shared assets, income, contributions." Zoe nodded slowly, as if processing something deeper than his answer. "And you believe you understand all of that?" she asked. Marcus frowned slightly. "Yes," he said, a bit more firmly than before. Zoe didn't react immediately. She simply reached into her folder and pulled out a set of documents, placed them gently on the table, and slid them toward him. Marcus glanced down. At first, his expression didn't change. Then, it did, not dramatically, just subtly. The kind of shift that happens when something doesn't align with what you expected. "These aren't part of the shared assets," Zoe said calmly. They've always been separate. Marcus picked up the documents, scanning them quickly. Accounts, structures, figures. At first, it didn't fully register, because the numbers didn't make sense. Not in the context he had built in his mind. He looked up at her. What is this? Zoe met his gaze steadily. It's part of my life you never asked about. The words landed quietly, but they carried weight. Marcus's grip on the papers tightened slightly as he looked back down. This time, more carefully, and then, understanding began to form, slowly, uncomfortably, because the numbers weren't small. They weren't even moderate. They were significant. Marcus leaned back, exhaling once as his mind tried to catch up with what he was seeing. This doesn't. He started, then stopped. What? Didn't make sense? Or didn't fit the version of her he had believed? Zoe didn't rush him, didn't explain, didn't defend. She just let the truth sit there, because truth doesn't need to be forced. It just needs to be seen. Marcus looked at her again, really looked this time, and for the first time since they met. He realized something unsettling. He didn't fully know her. Not in the way he thought he did, not even close. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice quieter now. Zoe's expression didn't harden, it didn't soften either. It stayed. Honest. Because you never asked, she said. No accusation, just truth. Marcus frowned slightly. That's not fair, he said. Zoe tilted her head just slightly. Isn't it? She asked. Another pause. Longer this time, because fairness depends on perspective. And Marcus was starting to see a perspective he had ignored. You could have said something, he insisted. Zoe nodded. I could have, she agreed. Then she added, but I wanted to be seen without it. There it was. The real reason, not fear, not secrecy. Choice. Marcus leaned back, processing. And instead? He asked. Zoe held his gaze. Instead, you saw what made sense to you. The words didn't attack, but they revealed something deeper. Marcus had built an understanding of her, without ever confirming it. And now, that understanding was unraveling in front of him, piece by piece. And you let me, he said. Zoe didn't deny it. Yes, she said simply, because she had, not maliciously, not intentionally, but consistently, silence had allowed assumption to grow, and assumption had led to this. Marcus ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly, for the first time in a long time. He didn't have control of the situation, because control depends on knowing what you're dealing with. And right now, he was realizing he never did. The room fell quiet again. But this silence was different, heavier, clearer, more honest, and in that moment, both of them understood something important. This wasn't just a divorce. It was the result of two people who never fully understood each other, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't take the time to. And now, the truth had arrived, quiet, unavoidable, and far too late to ignore. Truth doesn't explode when it arrives. It settles, and once it does, everything that used to feel certain starts to shift. The room hadn't changed. Same table, same chairs, same quiet, controlled space. But nothing felt the same anymore. Marcus Hale sat back in his chair, the document still in his hand, his eyes scanning numbers that refused to align with the version of reality he had built. It wasn't just the amount, it was what it meant. For years he had believed something without ever questioning it, that Zoe was simple, comfortable, dependent, that she didn't operate at his level. And now, that belief wasn't just wrong, it was incomplete. And incomplete understanding is dangerous, because it leads to confident mistakes. Marcus set the papers down slowly, his movements more deliberate now. You've had this the whole time? He asked. Zoe nodded. Yes. No hesitation. No explanation layered on top. Just truth. Marcus exhaled, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table. And you never thought to mention it? There it was again. The same question. But this time, it sounded different. Less accusatory. More uncertain. Zoe studied him for a moment before answering. I thought about it, she said honestly. Marcus looked up, and Zoe's voice stayed calm. And every time I did, it felt like it would change something I wasn't ready to lose. Marcus frowned slightly. What does that mean? Zoe held his gaze. It means I wanted to be with you without it being part of the reason. The words landed quietly, but their meaning carried weight. Marcus leaned back, processing. So you chose not to tell me? To protect the relationship? Zoe tilted her head slightly. Partly, she said. And the other part? Zoe's expression shifted, just slightly. The other part is that I didn't think it mattered. Marcus let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh. It matters now. Zoe didn't disagree. No, she said softly. Now, it does. Another silence filled the space, but this one wasn't uncomfortable. It was revealing, because for the first time, they weren't speaking from assumption. They were speaking from truth. And truth doesn't always fix things. Sometimes, it just explains why they broke. Marcus stood up slowly, walking toward the window. He needed space, not physically, mentally, because everything he thought he understood was shifting. He looked out at the city, his reflection faint in the glass. For years he had measured value in visible growth, expansion, results, proof. And now, he was facing something he couldn't measure the same way. Zoe's life hadn't been stagnant. It had been intentional, quiet, deliberate, and he had mistaken that for lack, because it didn't look like his version of progress. Marcus ran a hand over his jaw, exhaling slowly. "This changes things," he said, more to himself than to her. Zoe didn't respond immediately, because she understood something he was just beginning to realize. Truth doesn't change the past. It just changes how you see it. And sometimes, that's harder. Marcus turned back toward her. "How long were you going to keep this from me?" Zoe didn't hesitate. "I wasn't planning to keep it from you forever." Marcus raised an eyebrow slightly. "But you didn't tell me." Zoe nodded. "No," she admitted. "Why?" The question came out more direct this time. Not defensive. Just searching. Zoe took a small breath before answering. "Because I thought if we were strong enough, it wouldn't matter." Marcus studied her. "And if we weren't?" Zoe held his gaze. "Then it would have told me something important." Marcus let that settle, because it did tell her something. Something neither of them could ignore now. He walked back to the table, sitting down again, his posture less rigid than before. For the first time since this started, he wasn't leading the conversation. He was trying to understand it. "That letter," he said, "from your father. That's when you decided to step into all of this?" Zoe shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "That's when I stopped avoiding it." Marcus frowned. "You were avoiding it?" Zoe nodded. "Yes." He leaned back again, trying to connect the pieces. "You had access to all of this, and chose not to use it." Zoe's answer was simple. "Yes." Marcus stared at her for a moment, because that didn't make sense to him. Not in the world he understood. "Why?" he asked. Zoe's expression didn't change. "Because I didn't want my life to be built on something I didn't choose." The room went quiet again. Marcus processed that, slowly. "You think I built my life on something I didn't choose?" he asked. Zoe shook her head. "No," she said. "I think you built your life proving something." The words hit differently, because they weren't criticism, they were observation. And observation is harder to argue with. Marcus leaned forward slightly. "And what do you think I'm proving?" Zoe didn't answer immediately. She gave the question the same consideration she had given everything else. Then she said, "That you're enough." The silence that followed was heavier than anything before it, because that wasn't a business answer. It wasn't strategic. It was personal, and Marcus didn't have a response ready for that. Because for the first time, he wasn't sure she was wrong. Zoe watched him carefully, not judging, not analyzing, just seeing him, because now she understood something she hadn't fully allowed herself to see before. Marcus wasn't driven by success alone. He was driven by validation, and validation changes how you make decisions, including the one he made about her. "You thought I wasn't enough for your life," she said quietly. Marcus looked up. "That's not what I—" Zoe shook her head gently. "It's okay," she said. "You don't have to explain it differently now." Marcus stopped, because she wasn't angry. She wasn't defensive. She was clear. And clarity leaves very little room for excuses. "You made a decision based on what you believed," she continued. "And I understand that." Marcus studied her, something unsettled in his chest. "You don't sound upset." Zoe gave a small, almost thoughtful smile. "I was," she said, "just not in the way you expected." He frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Zoe leaned back in her chair. "It means I wasn't upset that you left," she said. Marcus's expression tightened slightly. "Then what were you upset about?" Zoe held his gaze. "That we never understood each other well enough to stop it." The words didn't accuse, they revealed, and that made them harder to ignore. Marcus looked down at the table, his fingers resting lightly against the documents. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about outcomes, or control, or strategy. He was thinking about something much simpler. A question, one he should have asked a long time ago, but didn't, because he assumed he already knew the answer. He looked up at her again. "Why didn't you ever correct me?" he asked. Zoe's expression softened slightly. "Because I thought you would eventually see me clearly," she said. Marcus's jaw tightened. "And when I didn't?" Zoe gave a small, quiet breath. "Then I knew something wasn't working the way it should." That was it. No blame, no anger, just acknowledgement. And sometimes, acknowledgement is harder to face than conflict. The room fell into silence again. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was final, because both of them understood something now that couldn't be undone. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about status. It wasn't even about the divorce anymore. It was about two people who built a relationship on partial understanding and never took the time to complete it. Marcus leaned back slowly, his mind quieter than it had been in days, not because everything made sense, but because something finally did. He had made a decision based on what he thought was true, and Zoe had allowed that version of truth to exist, not intentionally, but consistently, and now, they were both sitting in the result of that. The difference was, Zoe had accepted it. Marcus was just beginning to understand it, and understanding always comes with a cost. One he hadn't fully paid yet, but soon would. Understanding doesn't arrive all at once. It builds, piece by piece, until you can no longer ignore what's been right in front of you. Marcus Hale sat in the quiet room, the weight of the conversation settling deeper than he expected. The documents were still on the table, but they didn't feel like the focus anymore. Because this wasn't about numbers. It was about everything he didn't see, and everything he didn't ask. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his voice lower now, less controlled, more honest. "I thought I understood you," he said. Zoe didn't interrupt. She let him continue. Marcus exhaled slowly. "You were calm. You didn't chase things. You didn't push for more. I thought that meant you were comfortable staying the same." Zoe tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "And now?" she asked. Marcus paused, because answering that required admitting something uncomfortable. "Now, I think." He started, then stopped briefly before continuing. "I think I only understood the version of you that made sense to me." Zoe nodded once. "That's usually how it happens. No blame, no sharp edge, just truth." Marcus let out a quiet breath, leaning back again. "And you?" he asked. "Did you understand me?" Zoe's expression shifted slightly, not defensive, not guarded, just thoughtful. "I understood parts of you," she said. "Which parts?" Zoe met his eyes. "The parts you were comfortable showing." Marcus frowned slightly. "And the rest?" Zoe gave a small, almost knowing look. "You didn't spend much time there." That landed, because it was accurate. Marcus had always focused on what was visible, measurable, productive, not the parts that required slowing down, not the parts that asked deeper questions, and definitely not the parts that made him uncertain. He ran a hand over his face, exhaling. "This shouldn't feel this complicated," he said. Zoe shook her head gently. "It's not complicated," she replied. Marcus looked at her. "Then what is it?" Zoe's voice stayed steady. "It's just honest. And honesty always feels heavier than simplicity." The legal discussion resumed, but it didn't feel the same anymore. The words were still there. Assets, agreements, finalization. But underneath it, there was awareness now. Marcus reviewed the documents again, his eyes sharper this time. Not just scanning, but questioning. Because now, he knew something he didn't before. He hadn't seen the full picture. And once you realize that, you start looking differently. "This division," he said slowly, "it doesn't reflect everything." Zoe watched him. "What do you mean?" Marcus glanced at the additional documents she had shown him earlier. "It's incomplete," he admitted. Zoe didn't respond right away. "Because this moment mattered, not legally. Emotionally, you built this based on what you thought I had," she said. Marcus nodded slightly. "Yes. And now?" she asked. Marcus hesitated, then said honestly, "Now I know I was wrong." There it was, not defensive, not justified, just acknowledged. Zoe held his gaze for a second longer, then nodded once. "Okay." That word again, but this time, it didn't feel distant. It felt like acceptance of reality, not of the situation, of the truth. Marcus adjusted the papers in front of him, his movements slower now, more deliberate. "I'll have this revised," he said. "It should reflect everything accurately." Zoe leaned back slightly. "That's not necessary." Marcus looked up. "It is," he said. Zoe shook her head gently. "No," she replied. "It's not about the money." Marcus frowned slightly. "Then what is it about?" Zoe didn't hesitate. "It's about understanding." Marcus leaned back, studying her. "And what does that change?" Zoe held his gaze. "It changes how you see what happened." Marcus exhaled slowly. "And how do you see it now?" Zoe thought for a moment before answering. "I see two people who didn't communicate what mattered most," she said. Marcus nodded slightly. "That's accurate." Zoe continued. "And because of that, we made decisions based on incomplete information." Marcus let out a quiet breath. "Also accurate." A small pause. Then Zoe added, But the decision still stands. Marcus looked up, and there it was. The part he hadn't fully faced yet. The truth didn't reverse anything. It just explained it. And explanation doesn't always lead to correction, does it? He asked. Zoe didn't soften the answer. Yes. Simple, final, honest. The room felt different again. Not tense, not emotional, just clear, because clarity removes the possibility of pretending things are still uncertain. Marcus leaned back, his gaze drifting briefly to the window before returning to her. So, that's it? He asked. Zoe tilted her head slightly. What do you mean? Marcus's voice lowered. This changes everything, and nothing? Zoe considered that, then nodded. Yes. Marcus gave a short, quiet breath. That doesn't make sense. Zoe's expression stayed calm. It does, she said. You just don't like what it means. Marcus looked at her for a moment, then asked, and what does it mean? Zoe answered without hesitation. It means the decision you made wasn't based on the full truth, but it still revealed something real. Marcus frowned slightly. What? Zoe's voice softened, just slightly. That we weren't as strong as we thought we were. The words didn't hurt. They clarified, and sometimes, clarity hurts more than anything else. Marcus looked down at the table again, his fingers resting against the edge. For the first time since everything started, he wasn't trying to fix it. He was trying to understand it. And understanding takes humility, something he wasn't used to needing. I didn't think it would end like this, he said quietly. Zoe gave a small, thoughtful nod. Neither did I. Marcus looked up. Would it have changed anything, if I had known? Zoe didn't answer immediately, because that question mattered, and it deserved honesty. I don't know, she said finally. Marcus studied her. That's not very reassuring. Zoe gave a faint, almost reflective smile. It's not supposed to be. Marcus exhaled softly. Why not? Zoe held his gaze. Because the problem wasn't just what you didn't know, she said. Marcus frowned slightly. Then what was it? Zoe's answer came gently, but clearly. It was what we didn't talk about. That landed deeper than anything else, because it shifted the responsibility. Not just his, not just hers, both, and shared responsibility. Removes easy blame. The meeting ended without drama. No raised voices, no emotional outbursts. Just two people standing up from a table, gathering their things, and acknowledging something that couldn't be undone. Marcus picked up his jacket, pausing for a moment, before speaking. Zoe. She looked at him. Yes? He hesitated. Not because he didn't have something to say, but because he wasn't sure how to say it, which was new. He started, then stopped. Zoe waited, not impatient, just present. Marcus exhaled slowly. I should have asked more questions. There it was, not an apology, but something close. Zoe nodded once. Yes, she said, no comfort, no dismissal, just agreement, because growth doesn't come from being reassured. It comes from being honest. Marcus gave a small nod, accepting that, then turned toward the door. Zoe watched him go, not with regret, not with anger, but with understanding, because now, she saw everything clearly. What they had, what they missed, what they never gave each other the chance to fix, and clarity doesn't always bring closure. Sometimes, it just brings acceptance. Outside, the city moved the same way it always did, unchanged, unaffected, but inside both of them, something had shifted. Marcus walked forward carrying questions he didn't have answers to. Zoe walked forward carrying answers she didn't need to prove. And between those two paths, everything that was meant to happen next was already beginning, right here. This moment changes everything. So let me ask you, do you think the truth came too late? Or do you believe it still could have saved their relationship? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I really want to hear your perspective. This is Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, where every story reveals something deeper than it seems. Success doesn't always feel like success. Sometimes, it feels like silence. Marcus Hale had everything exactly where he wanted it. The deals were moving forward. The numbers were strong. The people around him were aligned, efficient, responsive. Everything worked. And yet, nothing felt right. It wasn't obvious. Not the kind of discomfort you can point at and fix. It was subtle, like something slightly out of place in a room you've been in too long to notice clearly. He stood in his office, staring at the city below, the same view that used to feel like proof of everything he had built. Now, it just looked distant, uninvolved, almost indifferent. His phone buzzed behind him. He didn't turn, didn't check, because for once, the urgency that used to drive him wasn't there. Instead, there was something else. A question, not loud, not demanding, just present. Was this worth it? Marcus frowned slightly, pushing the thought aside. Of course it was. This is what he had worked for, what he had sacrificed for, what he had built his identity around. So why did it feel like something was missing now that nothing was in his way? He turned back toward his desk, grabbing his phone, forcing himself back into motion. Emails, messages, expectations. This was familiar. This made sense. And yet, as he scrolled, none of it held his attention the way it used to, because attention follows meaning, and meaning was starting to feel unclear. Across the city, Zoe Bennett stood in front of a mirror she hadn't really looked into in a long time. Not because she avoided herself, but because she had grown comfortable not questioning what she saw. Today was different. She adjusted the sleeve of her blouse, her reflection steady, composed, but something beneath it had shifted. Not her appearance, her awareness. For years, she had chosen simplicity, neutral tones, quiet spaces, a life that didn't demand attention. And it wasn't wrong. But it wasn't complete either. She studied herself for a moment longer, then reached for a different jacket. Something structured, defined, not loud, but intentional. She slipped it on slowly, smoothing the fabric with a quiet precision. This wasn't about appearance. It was about alignment, who she was, and how she chose to show it. There's a difference, and for the first time, Zoe wasn't hiding behind simplicity. She was choosing her presence. Marcus sat across from his executive team later that afternoon, reviewing projections that should have held his full focus. If we push expansion into the next quarter, we can secure an additional 12% growth, someone said. Marcus nodded slightly. That works. The conversation continued. Strategies, adjustments, timelines, all the right words, all the right moves. But Marcus wasn't fully there, because part of his mind was somewhere else. Not in the past. Not even with Zoe specifically, but with something she said. You built your life proving something. At the time, it felt like an observation. Now, it felt like a question. What am I proving? He leaned back slightly, tuning out the conversation for just a second longer than he should have, because, for the first time, he didn't have a clear answer, and that unsettled him. Marcus had always known why he moved the way he did, or at least, he thought he did. But now, that clarity felt incomplete, like he had been running towards something without fully understanding what it was. Marcus? The voice pulled him back. He blinked slightly. Yes? We need your approval on the restructuring plan. Marcus glanced at the screen. Numbers, charts, logic, everything he usually trusted. Approved, he said, no hesitation. But as the meeting wrapped up, something became clear. He was still making decisions, still moving forward. But the certainty behind those decisions wasn't as strong as it used to be. And that mattered, because confidence without clarity eventually collapses. Zoe stepped into the office building just before noon. Not Marcus's, hers, or at least, the one that now belonged to her. The space was quiet, refined, not overly extravagant, but unmistakably powerful in its presence. People moved differently here, not rushed, not pressured, focused, intentional. Mr. Laurent met her near the entrance. You're early, he said. Zoe gave a small smile. I prefer it that way. He nodded, gesturing for her to follow him. As they walked through the space, Zoe noticed something she hadn't before. This wasn't just a place her father had built. It was a place he had designed to last. Every detail had purpose. Every decision had weight. And now, that responsibility belonged to her. How are you feeling about everything? Mr. Laurent asked. Zoe considered the question. Clear, she said. He glanced at her. That's a strong place to be. Zoe nodded slightly. It's a necessary one. Because clarity doesn't always feel good. But it always moves you forward. They stepped into a conference room where several individuals were already waiting. Advisors, executives, people who had worked with her father for years. Their attention shifted to her the moment she entered. Not curious, not doubtful, just observant. Zoe took her seat calmly, not trying to impress, not trying to prove, just present, and that alone changed the tone of the room. Let's begin, she said. No hesitation, no overthinking, just direction. Because stepping into something doesn't require noise, it requires readiness. Back across the city, Marcus sat alone in his office again, the building quieter now as the day slowed down. He loosened his tie, staring at the reflection of his own office in the darkened glass. Everything was still working. Nothing had fallen apart. So why did it feel like something already had? He leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. Because success isn't just about what you build, it's about what it costs you. And Marcus was starting to feel that cost. In ways he hadn't expected. Not financial, not professional, personal, emotional, internal. And those are the costs no one prepares you for. His phone buzzed again. This time, he picked it up immediately. A message from one of his investors. Strong presentation today. Looking forward to next quarter. Marcus stared at it for a second, then locked his phone. No satisfaction. No reaction. Just acknowledgement. Because validation only works when you still need it. And something inside him was starting to question whether he did. Zoe stood at the head of the conference table, reviewing final notes as the meeting wrapped up. You handled that well, Mr. Laurent said quietly. Zoe nodded. I understood what needed to be done. He studied her for a moment. You've changed. Zoe gave a small, thoughtful smile. No, she said. I've just stopped avoiding parts of myself. And that was the real shift. Because growth doesn't always mean becoming someone new. Sometimes it means finally becoming who you've always been. As the day came to an end, both of them stood in different places. Marcus, surrounded by everything he had built, but starting to question what it meant. Zoe, stepping into everything she had avoided, but finally understanding her place in it. And between those two realities, a quiet truth was forming. The life you choose is only as meaningful as the reason behind it. And when that reason becomes unclear, everything else begins to lose its weight. Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a brief moment. For the first time in years, he wasn't planning his next move. He wasn't chasing anything. He wasn't proving anything. He was just sitting there. And that stillness felt unfamiliar, uncomfortable, but necessary. Because sometimes, the moment you stop moving is the moment you realize where you've actually been going. And Marcus wasn't sure he liked the answer. Not anymore. Regret doesn't arrive all at once. It builds quietly. In the spaces where certainty used to live, Marcus Hale didn't notice when the shift fully happened. At first, it was just distraction, a slight delay in focus, a pause where there used to be instant clarity. But now, it was something more. He sat in his office long after everyone else had left, the city outside dimming into scattered lights, his reflection faint in the glass. His laptop was open, unread emails stacked neatly, opportunities waiting, and yet, he hadn't touched any of it, because, for the first time, forward didn't feel as clear as it used to. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. There was no crisis, no failure, nothing had gone wrong. And maybe that was the problem, because when everything looks right, but feels wrong, you don't know where to start fixing it. A memory surfaced, uninvited, unplanned. Zoe sitting across from him months ago, quietly watching him as he worked through numbers late into the night. You don't stop, she had said. He didn't look up. That's how things get built. She tilted her head slightly, and when it's built, he had paused then, just briefly. Then you maintain it. Zoe had smiled faintly. And when do you enjoy it? He didn't answer, because that question didn't fit into how he operated. Now, sitting alone in the silence of his office, he realized something he hadn't allowed himself to consider before. He didn't know how to enjoy anything he built, only how to build it. And suddenly, that didn't feel like strength. It felt like limitation. Across the city, Zoe Bennett stood on a quiet balcony overlooking the skyline, the night air cool against her skin. The day had been full, meetings, decisions, responsibilities she had once avoided, now handled with quiet confidence, not perfectly, but intentionally. She leaned lightly against the railing, her gaze steady. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was holding herself back. She felt aligned, and alignment brings a kind of peace that doesn't need validation. Her phone buzzed softly in her hand. A message. Marcus. She stared at the screen for a moment, then opened it. Can we talk? 2 simple words, but they carried something different this time. Not control, not structure, something closer to uncertainty. Zoe didn't respond immediately, not because she was avoiding him, but because she understood something now. Not every conversation needs to happen right away. Some need space to mean something. She locked her phone and slipped it into her pocket, her gaze returning to the city, because whatever Marcus needed to say, she already knew it wouldn't change what had already happened. And that mattered. Marcus stared at his phone after sending the message, waiting. Again, and this time, it felt different. Because he wasn't waiting for convenience, he was waiting for connection. And connection isn't something you can control. Minutes passed, no response. He set the phone down, running a hand through his hair as he stood up, pacing slowly across the room. This wasn't like him. He didn't reach out like this, didn't revisit decisions, didn't look back. But this didn't feel like looking back. It felt like understanding something he missed, and that difference mattered. Because this wasn't about reversing the decision. It was about facing it fully. He stopped near the window, his reflection staring back at him. For the first time in a long time, Marcus allowed himself to ask a question he had avoided. What if I was wrong? Not partially wrong, not slightly off, completely wrong. The thought didn't break him, but it shifted something, because admitting that possibility required letting go of something he relied on, certainty. And without certainty, everything becomes less predictable, less controlled, more real. Zoe stepped back inside her apartment, closing the balcony door softly behind her. The space felt calm, grounded, different from before. Not because it had changed, but because she had. She walked toward the table, glancing briefly at the folder resting there. Her life, her responsibility, her choice, all of it now fully within her reach. And yet, she didn't feel overwhelmed. She felt steady, because clarity removes fear, not completely, but enough to move forward. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Marcus. I just want to understand something. Zoe read it slowly, then sat down, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table. This wasn't about the documents, or the divorce. This was about him trying to catch up to something she had already accepted, and she understood that. But understanding doesn't always mean engaging, not immediately, because sometimes growth requires distance, not avoidance, not rejection, just space. Zoe typed a response, paused, then erased it, because she wasn't ready to have that conversation yet. Not because she didn't have answers, but because she knew. Some answers don't land the same when someone isn't ready to hear them. Marcus exhaled sharply when no response came. Not frustration, not anger, just awareness, because now he understood something clearly. Zoe wasn't ignoring him. She was choosing her timing, and that was new, because before, she would have responded, adjusted, met him where he was. Now, she wasn't, and that shift said more than anything she could have written. He sat back down slowly, his mind quieter now, not resolved, but clearer, because for the first time, he wasn't trying to fix the situation, he was trying to understand his role in it. And that required something he hadn't practiced enough. Accountability, not just for the decision, but for how he arrived at it. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands loosely clasped. He had assumed, he had concluded, he had acted, all without asking the one thing that could have changed everything. Who is she, really? And now, that question felt heavier than anything else, because it came too late. Across the city, Zoe stood in her room, looking out the window once more. Her reflection faint in the glass, calm, grounded, present. She didn't feel like she had won anything, didn't feel like she had lost everything either. She felt clear, and clarity doesn't celebrate, it stabilizes. She thought about Marcus's message again. Can we talk? And for a moment, she considered it, not because she needed to, but because she understood something important. Closure isn't always about the past. Sometimes, it's about how you move forward. She took a slow breath, then quietly said to herself, not yet, because timing matters, more than people realize, and this time, she wasn't going to rush it. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing briefly. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't focused on what came next. He was sitting with what already happened, and that was unfamiliar, uncomfortable, but necessary. Because understanding doesn't come from moving forward. It comes from finally facing what you didn't see before. Two people, same ending, different stages of understanding. Zoe had reached clarity. Marcus was just beginning, and between those 2 points, there was something neither of them could avoid anymore. The cost of what wasn't said is always paid eventually. And now, Marcus was starting to feel exactly what that cost was. Healing doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It happens quietly. In the way you begin to choose yourself differently. Zoe Bennett didn't wake up feeling transformed. There was no sudden confidence, no overwhelming clarity, just steadiness. The kind that builds slowly when you stop questioning your own direction. She stood in her apartment, sunlight stretching across the floor, her movements calm as she got ready for the day. Everything felt familiar, but she didn't. And that difference mattered, because for the first time, she wasn't adjusting herself to fit a version of life she had outgrown. She was stepping into one she had finally accepted. Her reflection in the mirror held her attention for a moment longer than usual, not out of doubt, but awareness. She adjusted her jacket slightly, her posture relaxed but intentional. This wasn't about looking different. It was about showing up differently. There's a quiet power in that, the kind that doesn't need approval, because it's not trying to prove anything. Across the city, Marcus Hale didn't sleep well, not because something was wrong, but because something was unsettled. He lay in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, his mind moving through thoughts he couldn't organize the way he usually did. There was no structure to them, No clear direction, just fragments, moments, questions, Zoe's voice, her words, her calm, her clarity. It all sat with him in a way he couldn't ignore anymore. He finally sat up, running a hand over his face. This wasn't like him. He didn't lose focus, didn't sit in uncertainty. But now, he was, and it wasn't going away. Zoe arrived at the office earlier than expected, not out of urgency, out of intention. She walked through the space with a quiet awareness, noticing details she hadn't fully seen before. The rhythm of the place, the people, the structure. This wasn't new. She had just never fully stepped into it. Until now. "Good morning," Mr. Laurent greeted as she entered the conference room. "Good morning," Zoe replied, setting her folder down. He studied her briefly. "You're settling in faster than I expected." Zoe gave a small smile. "I'm not trying to rush it," she said. "I'm just not avoiding it anymore." Mr. Laurent nodded. "That's usually what makes the difference." They sat across from each other, reviewing documents that now felt less like pressure, and more like responsibility. Zoe didn't skim. She read, asked questions, paused where things didn't fully align, because understanding mattered more than speed. "This investment branch," she said, pointing lightly at the document. "What's the long-term strategy behind it?" Mr. Laurent leaned forward slightly. "Stability over rapid growth," he explained. "Your father preferred sustainability." Zoe nodded slowly. "That makes sense. Not because it was safe, but because it was intentional, and intentional decisions last longer." Marcus sat in his office, staring at a document he had already read 3 times, and still hadn't processed, because his focus wasn't on the content. It was on everything else. His phone sat beside him, silent, no message from Zoe, and for once, he noticed the silence more than the noise, because silence forces you to face your own thoughts. And Marcus was running out of ways to avoid them. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. There was a time when his days felt clear, decisions were sharp, direction was obvious. Now, everything felt slightly blurred, not because he didn't know what to do, but because he was starting to question why he was doing it, and that kind of question changes everything. Zoe stepped into another meeting, this one more detailed, more involved. People spoke, numbers moved, strategies were discussed, and this time, she didn't feel like an observer. She felt present, engaged, capable, not because she had suddenly become something new, but because she had stopped holding herself back from what she already was. And that shift was enough. "Your input?" someone asked, turning toward her. Zoe paused for a second, not out of hesitation, out of intention. Then she spoke, measured, clear, grounded, not trying to impress, just contributing, and that alone shifted how the room responded to her. Because confidence doesn't come from speaking louder. It comes from knowing you belong in the conversation. Marcus stood by the window again, later that afternoon. It had become a pattern, not because he liked it, but because he didn't know what else to do with the stillness. The city moved the same way it always had. Fast, focused, driven, just like him. And yet, he didn't feel connected to it the same way anymore, because something had shifted internally. And once that happens, everything external feels different too. A memory surfaced again. Zoe standing by the window in their apartment, looking out just like this. "You don't stop long enough to notice anything," she had said. Marcus had shrugged slightly. "There's always something to do." Zoe turned to him. "There's always something to feel too," she replied. He didn't respond then, because feeling wasn't something he prioritized. Now, he was starting to understand what she meant. He looked down at his phone again. Still nothing. And for the first time, he didn't reach for it, because he understood something now that he hadn't before. Not everything can be resolved immediately. Some things take time. Zoe stepped out of the building later that evening, the day settling behind her in a way that felt complete, not exhausting, not overwhelming, just full. She paused for a moment outside, taking in the air, the movement, the quiet energy of the city around her. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was catching up to her life. She felt like she was living it. Her phone buzzed softly. She glanced at it. Another message from Marcus. She didn't open it immediately. Instead, she looked out at the street, her expression thoughtful, because now, she understood something clearly. Responding wasn't the same as being ready, and she wasn't going to confuse the two. Marcus sat in the quiet of his office, his phone still in his hand. He hadn't written much, just a few words, but this time, they came from a different place. Not control, not expectation, something closer to honesty, and that alone felt unfamiliar. Zoe finally opened the message. "I'm trying to understand where I went wrong." She read it once, then again, and this time, she didn't feel distant. She felt aware, because that question wasn't about the relationship anymore. It was about him, and growth like that doesn't happen quickly. She locked her phone again, slipping it back into her bag, not ignoring it, not rejecting it, just giving it time, because some conversations deserve more than immediate answers. As the night settled over the city, both of them stood in different spaces. Marcus, beginning to question himself in ways he never had before. Zoe, beginning to trust herself in ways she never allowed before. And between those two shifts, a quiet truth continued to grow. You don't lose people because of one decision. You lose them because of everything that led to it. And understanding that is the first step toward becoming someone different. For both of them, growth doesn't announce itself. It shows up in the choices you make when no one is watching. Zoe Bennett didn't rush the next few days. That was the difference. Before, she would have felt the need to respond to Marcus, to the situation, to the shifting weight of everything happening around her. Now, she didn't, because she understood something clearly. Not every moment requires action. Some require presence. She stood in her office, reviewing a set of reports that once would have felt overwhelming. Now, they didn't, not because they were easier, but because she wasn't approaching them from uncertainty anymore. She was grounded. And grounding changes how everything feels. You're adapting quickly, Mr. Laurent said, stepping into the room. Zoe glanced up. I'm understanding more, she replied. He nodded. That's better than adapting. Because adaptation can be temporary. Understanding stays. She closed the file in front of her and leaned back slightly. There's something I've been thinking about, she said. Mr. Laurent waited. Zoe continued. For a long time, I thought avoiding responsibility was the same as choosing peace. He tilted his head slightly, and now? Zoe's expression remained calm. Now I think I was just choosing what felt easier. The honesty in that statement didn't weigh her down. It clarified her, because recognizing your own avoidance isn't weakness. It's awareness, and awareness changes your direction. Across the city, Marcus Hale sat in a quiet cafe instead of his office. That alone was unusual. He didn't do unstructured environments, didn't sit in places without purpose. But today, he needed distance from the patterns he had built, because those patterns weren't giving him answers anymore. A cup of coffee sat untouched in front of him. His phone rested beside it. Silent, still no response from Zoe. And for the first time, he didn't feel frustrated. He felt reflective, because now he understood something he hadn't before. Her silence wasn't rejection. It was intention, and intention deserves space. He leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting across the room. People talking, working, living, unaware of the quiet shift happening inside him. And for once, Marcus wasn't focused on what he needed to do next. He was focused on what he hadn't done before. Ask, listen, understand, simple things. But things he had overlooked, because he assumed efficiency mattered more than depth. Now, he wasn't so sure. A memory surfaced again. Zoe, sitting across from him at dinner one night, her expression thoughtful. You move through things quickly, she had said. Marcus had shrugged. That's how you stay ahead. She smiled faintly. Or how you miss things. He had dismissed that, because missing things didn't seem like a real risk. Now, it felt like the exact thing that happened. He reached for his phone, paused, then put it back down, because this time, he wasn't going to reach out again just to fill the silence. He was going to sit in it, and understand it. Zoe stepped out of a meeting later that afternoon, her movement steady, her expression calm. She wasn't trying to prove anything anymore, not to anyone, and especially not to herself, because she had already answered the question she had been avoiding for years. Who am I when I stop holding myself back? And now, she was living that answer. Her phone buzzed again. Marcus. She glanced at the screen, then looked away, not dismissing it, just not prioritizing it, because for the first time, her life wasn't orbiting around someone else's expectations. It was centered on her own clarity, and that shift changed everything. That evening, Zoe sat alone in her apartment, the quiet no longer heavy, just peaceful. She picked up her phone again, staring at Marcus's message. I'm trying to understand where I went wrong. The words felt different now, not urgent, not unresolved, just part of a process. And she respected that, because growth, real growth, doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds, slowly, intentionally. She typed a response, paused, read it, then sent it. You didn't just go wrong in one place. Miles away, Marcus's phone buzzed. He picked it up immediately. Read the message, and for a moment, he didn't react, because the truth in those words was clear and difficult. He typed back, then, where did I go wrong? This time, there was no delay in his intention. only in his understanding. Zoe read the message, and this time, she didn't hesitate, because now, she was ready. Not to fix anything, not to reopen anything, but to answer honestly. You stopped trying to understand me, and started assuming you already did. Marcus read it once, then again, and the more he read it, the more it settled, not as criticism, but as truth. Because when he thought about it, he had watched, observed, concluded, but he hadn't asked, not deeply, not consistently, and that difference had shaped everything. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. For the first time, he wasn't trying to defend himself. He was trying to see himself clearly, and that required something he hadn't practiced enough: humility. Zoe sat quietly after sending the message, her phone resting beside her. She didn't feel anxious, didn't feel uncertain, because she understood something important. Truth doesn't always create connection. Sometimes, it creates clarity, and clarity is enough. Marcus looked at the city outside again, but this time, he wasn't looking at it as something to conquer, or something to control. He was looking at it as something he had moved through too quickly to fully understand. Just like Zoe, two people, same past, different growth. Zoe had reached acceptance. Marcus was learning awareness, and between those two, something quiet was happening. Not reconciliation, not distance, something deeper. Understanding, and understanding is where everything begins to change. Some moments don't feel important when they begin. They feel routine, expected, procedural. But sometimes, those are the moments that change everything. The courtroom was quiet, not tense, not dramatic, just still. The kind of stillness that exists when something significant is about to be acknowledged, but not yet understood. Zoe Bennett sat calmly at her table, her posture relaxed, her expression steady, no visible nerves, no restless movement, just presence. Because she wasn't here to prove anything. She was here to finalize something, and that difference mattered. Across the room, Marcus Hale adjusted his jacket slightly, his eyes scanning the space with the same quiet control he carried into every environment. But this time, control felt different, less certain, because for the first time, he wasn't walking into a situation he fully understood, and that awareness stayed with him. Legal teams exchanged brief words, documents were organized, names were called, everything moved the way it was supposed to, efficient, structured, predictable, just like Marcus preferred. And yet, something about today didn't feel predictable, not because of what was happening, but because of what he had learned leading up to it. Zoe wasn't who he thought she was, not even close, and that truth hadn't fully settled yet. Because understanding something logically is very different from accepting it emotionally. Zoe glanced briefly across the room, not searching, just noticing. Marcus looked composed, as always, but she could see it now. The slight shift, the quiet uncertainty beneath the surface. Most people wouldn't notice it, but she did, because now, she understood him more clearly than she ever had before, and clarity changes how you see everything. "Please be seated," the judge said, entering the room. Everyone stood, then sat. The process began. Marcus focused on the proceedings, his attention sharper now, not because he needed to control the situation, but because he needed to understand it. Every word, every detail, because this time, he knew what it felt like to miss something important, and he wasn't going to do that again. Zoe remained still, her hands resting lightly in front of her. No tension, no urgency, because she wasn't waiting for an outcome. She already understood it. This wasn't about winning. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about closing a chapter that had already ended, and she was ready for that. The legal discussion moved forward. Assets, agreements, final terms, everything outlined, everything clear, or at least, that's what Marcus believed, until... "Before we proceed further," the judge said, glancing down at the documents, "there appears to be additional financial information that was not initially included in the filings." Marcus's attention sharpened instantly. Additional? His eyes moved toward his lawyer, who looked equally surprised. That information was not part of the original disclosure, his lawyer said carefully. The judge nodded. "It has been submitted for review." Zoe didn't move, didn't react, because she already knew. Marcus turned his head slightly, looking at her. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and in that moment, he understood something. This wasn't new information to her. This was something she had already accepted, and that realization shifted something in him. The judge adjusted the papers, his tone steady. "These documents reflect independent financial holdings under Ms. Bennett's name, structured separately from shared marital assets." The room stayed quiet, because no one fully understood what that meant yet. except Zoe, and now, Marcus, or at least. He was beginning to. The judge continued. The valuation of these holdings. A brief pause. Exceeds $2 billion. Silence. Not dramatic, not loud, just complete. Because the kind of truth that shifts everything doesn't need noise. Marcus didn't react immediately, not outwardly, because his mind hadn't fully caught up yet. 2 billion. The number didn't just feel large, it felt disconnected from everything he believed, because it didn't fit, didn't align, didn't make sense in the reality he had built. He looked down at the table, then back at Zoe, and for the first time, he wasn't seeing her through assumption, or expectation, or interpretation. He was seeing her without any of that, and that clarity hit harder than the number itself. Zoe sat exactly the same way she had before, calm, composed, unchanged, because nothing about this was new to her, only to everyone else. Marcus leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, not in shock, but in realization, because suddenly, everything connected. Her calm, her silence, her clarity. It wasn't passivity, it wasn't lack, it was certainty, the kind he thought he had, but never actually questioned. The judge continued speaking, but Marcus barely heard it, because something else had taken his attention. A simple realization. He didn't just misunderstand Zoe, he underestimated her, completely, and that realization carried weight, not because of what she had, but because of what he assumed she didn't. Zoe didn't look at him again, she didn't need to, because this moment wasn't about him understanding her. It was about her no longer needing to be understood, and that difference marked the end of something, completely. The courtroom remained quiet as the process moved forward, but nothing felt the same anymore, because now, the truth was visible, not hidden, not assumed, not incomplete, clear, and clarity always changes the outcome, even if the decision stays the same. Marcus sat still, his hands resting lightly against the table. For the first time in his life, he felt something he couldn't control, not the situation, not the outcome, just the understanding, because now, he wasn't just seeing Zoe differently, he was seeing himself differently, and that was the part that stayed. Two people, same room, same moment, but completely different realities. Zoe, at peace with what was already true. Marcus, finally facing what he never took the time to see, and between those two, everything that was left was about to become clear. Silence doesn't always mean nothing is happening. Sometimes, it means everything is being understood at once. The courtroom remained still, but the energy had shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, just undeniably. Marcus Hale sat motionless, the judge's words still echoing in his mind, not as sound, but as realization. 2 billion. It wasn't just the number, it was everything attached to it, everything he didn't see, everything he didn't ask, everything he assumed, and now, everything he had to face. The judge continued, reviewing the newly submitted disclosures with calm precision. These holdings are independently structured, and were not part of the marital estate, he said. Therefore, they are not subject to division. Marcus heard the words, but what he felt was something else. Not loss, not even regret. Yet, it was awareness. The kind that doesn't hit all at once, but settles into every corner of your thinking. Because now, there was no version of this situation where he could pretend he had understood Zoe correctly. That version was gone. Across the table, Zoe Bennett remained exactly as she had been. Still, present, grounded. She wasn't watching the reactions in the room. She wasn't looking at Marcus. Because this moment wasn't about validation. It wasn't about proving anything. It was simply the truth becoming visible. And she had already accepted it long before anyone else did. Marcus finally shifted slightly in his seat, his fingers tightening briefly against the edge of the table before relaxing again. He wasn't shaken in the way most people would expect. No visible reaction, no sudden movement, but inside, something was restructuring. Quietly, completely, because understanding doesn't always break you. Sometimes, it rearranges how you see everything. He glanced down at the documents again, then, back up, and for the first time, he allowed himself to sit in one simple truth. I didn't know her. Not fully, not deeply, not honestly, and everything that followed that lack of understanding was built on that. The legal process continued. Clarifications, final confirmations, procedural steps, but none of it carried the same weight anymore, because the real shift had already happened. The truth had been revealed. And once that happens, everything else becomes secondary. Marcus turned his head slightly. This time, he looked at Zoe again, Not out of curiosity, not out of confusion, but out of recognition. She wasn't the person he thought he married. And more importantly, she wasn't the person he thought he left. She was someone he never fully took the time to understand. And that realization didn't come with anger. It came with something heavier, responsibility. Zoe felt his gaze, but didn't immediately return it. Not because she was avoiding it, but because she didn't need to meet it. She had already moved past the point where his understanding defined anything for her. And that wasn't distance. It was clarity. Eventually, she looked up. Their eyes met again, and this time, there was no confusion in his, just awareness. And for the first time, she saw it. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Marcus finally understood something real, not about her life, but about his assumptions, and that mattered, even if it came too late. The judge closed the file. Given the complete disclosures and the agreements presented, the court finds no outstanding disputes regarding asset division. He said, a brief pause. Divorce granted. No drama, no reaction. Just a sentence. Simple, final, irreversible. Zoe exhaled slowly. Not relief, not sadness, just acknowledgement. Because endings don't always come with emotion. Sometimes, they come with understanding. Marcus didn't move immediately. The words settled into him differently than he expected. Not as a loss, not as a victory, just an outcome. The result of everything that led to this point. And now, there was nothing left to decide, only something left to accept. People began to move. Chairs shifted. Papers gathered. Conversations resumed quietly. The room returned to normal. But nothing about this moment was normal. Because something fundamental had changed. Not externally, internally. Zoe stood, gathering her things with calm precision. No rush, no hesitation, just movement. Forward. Marcus stood a moment later. Not following, not leading, just moving. And for a brief moment, they found themselves near the exit at the same time. Neither spoke immediately, because sometimes there's nothing left to say that hasn't already been understood. Marcus looked at her, really looked, not the version he had built in his mind, not the version he assumed, just her as she was. And for the first time, there was no interpretation, only clarity. I understand now, he said quietly. Zoe held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once. I know. No distance, no softness, just acknowledgement. Because she did know. She had seen it in the way he looked at her, in the way he listened, in the way he stopped trying to explain things. Understanding doesn't need to be announced loudly. It shows itself. Marcus exhaled slightly, his expression thoughtful. I should have asked more, he said. Zoe didn't disagree. Yes, she said. Again, simple, honest. Because growth doesn't come from being comforted. It comes from recognizing what you didn't do. A small pause. Then Marcus added, I didn't think it would matter this much. Zoe studied him briefly. It always does, she said. Not harsh, not emotional, just true. Because the things we overlook are usually the things that matter most. Marcus nodded slowly, taking that in, not resisting it, not correcting it, just accepting it. And that alone showed how much had shifted. Zoe adjusted her bag slightly, stepping toward the exit, then paused. Not because she was unsure, but because there was one last thing that needed to be understood. She turned slightly back toward him. This didn't end because of money, she said. Marcus met her eyes. I know. Zoe held his gaze for a second longer. It ended because we didn't take the time to understand each other when it mattered. Marcus nodded. Yes. And this time, there was no hesitation in it. That was it. No dramatic goodbye. No lingering moment. Just clarity. Complete. Zoe turned and walked away. Not fast. Not slow. Just forward. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was leaving something behind. She felt like she was stepping fully into something ahead. Marcus stood there for a moment longer, watching her go, not with regret, not with longing, but with understanding. Because now, he could finally see the full picture, not just who she was, but who he had been, and that awareness would stay with him far longer than the relationship ever did. Outside, the city moved exactly the same. Cars passed, people walked, life continued, unchanged. But for them, everything had shifted. Two people, one ending, no confusion left, just clarity. And sometimes, that's the most honest ending there is. Endings don't always feel like endings. Sometimes, they feel like quiet beginnings. The city didn't change after the courtroom. It didn't pause, didn't acknowledge what had just happened. It simply continued. And so did Zoe Bennett. She stepped out of the courthouse into the open air, the weight of the day settling, Not heavily, not dramatically. Just present. For a moment, she stood still. Not because she didn't know where to go, but because she understood something clearly. There was nowhere she needed to rush to anymore, and that feeling was new. Her phone buzzed softly in her hand. Messages, notifications, life continuing. But none of it felt urgent, because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't reacting to her life. She was choosing it. Zoe took a slow breath, her gaze lifting to the skyline. Everything looked the same, but she didn't. And that difference mattered more than anything else, because growth isn't always visible to others. Sometimes, it's something only you can feel. Across the steps behind her, Marcus Hale walked out a few minutes later. He didn't look for her immediately, didn't rush, didn't call out, because, for the first time, he wasn't trying to control the moment. He was allowing it to exist, as it was. He paused at the top of the steps, his eyes scanning the city without focus. There was no next move waiting, no plan to execute, no decision to make, just space. And space was something he hadn't known how to handle before. He saw her then, not far, standing still, calm, unbothered, and something about that didn't feel distant. It felt complete. Marcus walked down slowly, stopping a few steps away from her, close enough to speak, far enough to respect the distance between them. Zoe turned slightly, sensing him. Their eyes met. No tension, no unresolved emotion, just awareness. I didn't think it would feel like this, Marcus said. Zoe tilted her head slightly. Like what? Marcus exhaled slowly. Not like a loss, he said. More like something I'm only now starting to understand. Zoe considered that, then nodded. That's usually how it works, she said. A quiet pause settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just real. Marcus looked out at the city again. I keep thinking about everything I assumed, he said. Zoe didn't interrupt. I thought I understood what mattered, he continued. But I was only looking at what I could measure. Zoe glanced at him. And now? Marcus gave a small, almost thoughtful breath. Now I realize I never asked what couldn't be measured. Zoe's expression softened slightly, not emotionally. Just acknowledging the truth in that. That's where most of the important things are, she said. Marcus nodded. I see that now. Another pause. Then Marcus added, I don't think I would have listened even if you told me. Zoe looked at him. Honest, not defensive. Maybe not, she said. Marcus let out a quiet breath. Which means this wasn't just about what I didn't know. Zoe nodded. It never was. Marcus turned toward her again. I keep thinking, if I had just slowed down, just once, maybe things would have been different. Zoe didn't answer immediately, because that question didn't have a simple answer. Then she said, maybe. Marcus waited, but she didn't continue, because maybe was enough. Anything more would have been speculation, and this moment was about truth. He nodded slowly, accepting that, because sometimes closure doesn't come from certainty. It comes from understanding the possibility. Zoe adjusted her bag slightly. I should go, she said. Marcus didn't stop her, didn't ask her to, because now he understood something he didn't before. Letting go isn't about giving up. It's about respecting what is. Zoe, he said quietly. She paused, turned back slightly. Yes? Marcus held her gaze for a moment. I'm glad I understand now, he said. Zoe studied him, then nodded. I am too. No dramatic goodbye, no lingering moment, just acknowledgement, because everything that needed to be said already had been. Zoe turned and walked away, this time, without looking back, not because she was trying to be strong, but because she didn't need to. Marcus watched her go, not with regret, not with longing, but with clarity, and clarity feels different than anything else. It doesn't pull you backward, it moves you forward, even when it's uncomfortable. He stood there for a moment longer, then turned in the opposite direction, not chasing anything, not escaping anything, just walking. That night, Zoe sat by her window again, the same place, the same view, but a completely different feeling. The quiet didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt peaceful, because there was nothing left unresolved inside her. No questions waiting for answers, no emotions waiting to be processed, just clarity. And clarity is enough. She picked up a notebook from the table beside her, not something she used often, but tonight, it felt right. She opened it, paused for a moment, then wrote, choose understanding before conclusion. She looked at the words for a second longer, then closed the notebook gently, because that lesson wasn't something she needed to revisit. It was something she had lived. Across the city, Marcus sat in his apartment, the lights dim, the space quiet. He didn't turn on the TV, didn't open his laptop, didn't reach for his phone. He just sat there, and for the first time, he allowed himself to feel something fully, not rush it, not analyze it, just sit with it. He thought about everything, the assumptions, the silence, the decision, and, for the first time, he didn't try to justify any of it. He simply saw it. Clearly, he stood up slowly, walking toward the window. The same view, the same city, but something about it felt different now. Not because it changed, but because he had. Marcus rested his hand lightly against the glass, and quietly said to himself, "I should have asked." No frustration, no anger, just truth. And sometimes, that's where growth begins. Not in what you fix, but in what you finally understand. Two people, same story, different outcomes. Zoe, at peace with her clarity. Marcus, beginning his journey toward it. And between those two, the most important lesson remained. Love doesn't fail because of one big mistake. It fails because of the small things we choose not to understand. And that is what changes everything. Time doesn't fix everything, but it reveals what stays, and what was never meant to. Weeks passed, not dramatically, not in a way that marked a clear before and after, just quietly, consistently, the kind of time that doesn't demand attention, but changes you anyway. Zoe Bennett didn't look back, not because she was trying to forget, but because she no longer needed to revisit what she had already understood. Her days settled into a rhythm that felt different from anything she had lived before. Not simpler, not busier, just aligned. She woke up without hesitation, moved through her work with clarity, made decisions without second-guessing herself, and most importantly, she didn't shrink herself to fit into anything that no longer reflected who she was. One morning, she stood in her office, reviewing a long-term strategy proposal. The room was quiet, focused, the kind of environment that required presence, not performance. "Your thoughts?" one of the advisors asked. Zoe paused, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she gave herself the time to think before she spoke. Then she answered, clear, grounded, intentional, and as she spoke, she realized something. She wasn't stepping into someone else's role anymore. She was fully stepping into her own. Across the city, Marcus Hale's life hadn't stopped. It couldn't. Too many people relied on him. Too many things moved because of him. But something inside him had slowed down. Not his work, not his responsibilities, just his approach. He asked more questions now, listened longer, paused before making decisions. Small changes, but meaningful ones, because for the first time, he understood the cost of moving too quickly. He sat in a meeting, listening, as one of his executives presented a new expansion plan. In the past, he would have interrupted, refined it, redirected it. This time, he waited. Why this direction? He asked calmly. The room shifted slightly, because that question was different. It wasn't about results. It was about understanding, and that changed everything. The executive hesitated for a moment, then explained, and for the first time, Marcus didn't just hear the answer, he understood it, because he had learned something simple, but powerful. You can't lead what you don't take the time to understand. That evening, Marcus sat alone again, but it didn't feel the same as before. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective. He wasn't avoiding his thoughts anymore. He was learning from them. And that shift was something he didn't expect. A memory surfaced. Zoe, sitting across from him, asking a question he had once dismissed. What matters to you, beyond all of this? He hadn't answered then, because he didn't have one. Now, he did. Understanding, connection, presence, things he used to overlook. Now, they felt essential. Marcus stood up slowly, walking toward the window again. It wasn't a habit anymore. It was a moment, a pause, a way to reflect. And this time, he didn't feel like something was missing. He felt like something was changing, not everything, but enough. Across the city, Zoe stepped out of her office building as the sun began to set. The sky stretched wide, painted in quiet shades of gold and soft blue. She paused for a moment, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. That was the difference. She wasn't rushing through her life anymore. She was present in it. Her phone buzzed softly. A message, unknown number. She opened it. Hope you're doing well. Marcus. She read it once, then again, and for a moment, she just stood there, not pulled, not conflicted, just aware. Because this message wasn't about reopening anything. It was about acknowledgement, and she respected that. Zoe typed a response. Simple, honest, I am. I hope you are too. She didn't add anything more, because she didn't need to, and neither did he. Miles away, Marcus read the message. A small quiet smile touched his expression, not out of longing, not out of regret, but out of understanding, because this was enough. He typed back, "I'm getting there," then set his phone down, not waiting for a reply, not expecting one, just content with what was. Zoe slipped her phone into her bag and continued walking forward, not carrying anything unnecessary, not holding onto anything unresolved, just moving. Marcus leaned back in his chair later that night, his mind calm in a way he hadn't experienced in a long time. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything made sense, and sometimes, that's more important. Two people, one story, no longer connected by what they had lost, but shaped by what they had learned. Zoe learned that silence has consequences, that avoiding difficult conversations doesn't protect love. It weakens it, and that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. Marcus learned that assumptions are dangerous, that success without understanding is incomplete, and that the questions you don't ask are often the ones that matter most. They didn't end up together, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't understand each other in time, and timing matters more than people realize. But what remained was something more valuable than what they lost. Clarity, growth, awareness, and sometimes that's the most honest ending a story can have. Not perfect, not ideal, but real, because love isn't just about finding the right person. It's about becoming the right version of yourself before it's too late. And this time, they finally did, separately, but completely. If this story made you pause, even for a moment, then it did its job. This is Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, where every story isn't just told, it's felt. So tell me in the comments, do you think Marcus and Zoe could have worked if they had just understood each other sooner? And if you believe that small decisions can change everything, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the next story might feel even closer to home. Be honest, would you have told the truth like Zoe, or stayed silent like she did? I want to know what you would have done.